Thank you so much for being here. I really do. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to get comfortable, slow down a bit, and prepare to hear a story that can't be told quickly. One of those stories that requires time, silence, and attention, because it speaks not only of battles and betrayals, but also of human decisions that change the course of an entire country. Get comfortable, adjust the volume, perhaps make some coffee, or simply lie back for a moment. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale from the past, it's an open question about the present and the future we continue to build today. The last samurai who betrayed an empire. History remembers traitors and heroes very differently, but sometimes the same man becomes both. In the final years of the samurai era, one warrior stood at the center of Japan's greatest transformation. He helped destroy an ancient system, helped build a modern empire, and then turned against everything he had created. His name was Saigo Takamori, and his life became the last great tragedy of the samurai world. In 1877, when his rebellion collapsed in the mountains of southern Japan, the new imperial government labeled him a traitor, but the people remembered him differently. To them, he was not a rebel, but the last true samurai, a man who embodied honor in a world that no longer had a place for it. His story is not only about war and betrayal, it is about a man crushed between loyalty and conscience, between tradition and progress, between the past and the future. To understand how Saigo Takamori became both a national hero and an enemy of the state, we must go back to a Japan that no longer exists. For more than 200 years, Japan had lived under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. The emperor was sacred but powerless. Real authority belonged to the shogun and the feudal lords known as daimyo. The samurai were the backbone of this system. They lived by strict codes of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. But by the mid-19th century, this world was collapsing. Western powers arrived with gunboats and demands. Japan was forced to open its ports, and the weakness of the shogunate became impossible to hide. Among the many young samurai who believed the old order had failed was Saigo Takamori. Born in 1828 in the Satsuma domain, one of the most powerful regions in southern Japan, Saigo grew up poor but proud. He was tall, physically imposing, and deeply committed to the samurai code. More than ambition, he possessed an intense sense of moral duty. He believed that Japan needed change, but not at the cost of its soul. As foreign pressure mounted, Satsuma became a center of resistance against the Tokugawa regime. Saigo rose quickly within its ranks, not because he was a brilliant strategist, but because men trusted him. He spoke plainly, lived simply, and showed no fear in the face of danger. To many, he became the embodiment of the ideal samurai. By the 1860s, Japan stood on the edge of revolution. A coalition of southern domains, including Satsuma and Choshu, decided that the shogunate had to fall. Their goal was to restore power to the emperor, but in reality they were preparing to create a completely new political order. Saigo became one of the key military leaders of this movement. In 1868, civil war erupted. The conflict would later be called the Boshin War, but at the time it was simply a fight for the future of Japan. Saigo led imperial forces against the armies loyal to the shogun. The battles were brutal but decisive. One by one, the shogunate's strongholds fell. By the end of the year, the old regime was gone. The emperor was restored to power, and the Meiji era began. To the world, this looked like a triumph of tradition. The emperor had returned, and the samurai had defended him. But in reality, the victory marked the beginning of the end for the samurai class itself. The new government, dominated by men from Satsuma and Choshu, moved quickly to modernize Japan. They studied Western armies, industries, and governments. They built railroads, factories, and schools. They introduced a national army based on conscription, not samurai privilege. Step by step, the very class that had brought them to power was stripped of its purpose. At first, Saigo supported these changes. He believed Japan needed strength to survive in a world dominated by imperial powers. He accepted the end of the feudal system and the abolition of samurai stipends, even though it meant poverty for many of his own men. But there was a limit to what he could accept. The breaking point came with the issue of Korea. Many samurai, including Saigo, believed that Japan should send a military expedition to Korea. Officially, the reason was diplomatic insult. Unofficially, it was something deeper. The samurai were losing their role in society, and war offered them a new purpose. Saigo himself volunteered to go as an envoy, fully aware that he might be killed and that his death could justify war. The government refused. They feared international conflict and wanted to focus on internal modernization. To Saigo, this decision felt like betrayal, not just of him, but of the entire warrior class that had sacrificed everything to create the new Japan. In 1873, he resigned from the government and returned to Satsuma. There, he founded private academies for former samurai. Officially, they were schools. In reality, they became centers of growing resentment. Thousands of unemployed warriors gathered around Saigo, not because he told them to rebel, but because his presence gave them hope. He never openly called for revolt, but the movement slowly escaped his control. By 1876, tensions had reached a breaking point. The government banned the wearing of swords, the last visible symbol of samurai identity. To many, this was not reform, it was humiliation. In early 1877, the central government discovered that weapons stored in Kagoshima, Saigo's home region, had been secretly removed. Rumors spread that Tokyo planned to assassinate him. Whether these rumors were true no longer mattered. The situation exploded. Surrounded by thousands of angry samurai, Saigo made the most painful decision of his life. He would march on Tokyo, not to overthrow the emperor, but to confront the government in his name. In his mind, this was not rebellion, it was loyalty taken to its ultimate extreme. Thus began the Satsuma Rebellion, the last civil war fought by samurai. At first, the rebels were confident. They were veterans, men trained in swordsmanship and discipline since childhood. Saigo believed that if he could force negotiations, the government would listen. But the Japan he faced was no longer the one he had helped create. The imperial army that met him was not a feudal force. It was modern, equipped with rifles, artillery, and organized command structures inspired by Europe. Many of its soldiers were commoners, men who would once have bowed before samurai. Now they stood against them as equals on the battlefield. The rebellion quickly turned into a nightmare. Saigo's forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from supplies. One by one, his strongholds fell. Each defeat made the gap between the old world and the new brutally clear. As months passed, the rebellion became less a campaign and more a slow execution. Saigo refused to surrender. To do so would mean admitting that the samurai way of life had no place in modern Japan. He could not accept that. In September 1877, the final battle took place at Shiroyama, a mountain overlooking Kagoshima. Saigo had fewer than 500 men left. The imperial army surrounded them with over 30,000 troops and heavy artillery. Throughout the night, shells rained down on the mountain. By dawn, the samurai were exhausted, wounded, and out of ammunition. What happened next became legend. As the imperial forces advanced, Saigo, badly injured, realized the end had come. Accounts differ on his final moments. Some say he committed ritual suicide. Others claim he was too wounded and asked a loyal follower to end his life. What is certain is that when the battle ended, the last great samurai rebellion was over. The government declared victory. The era of the samurai officially ended that day. But something unexpected happened next. Instead of fading into disgrace, Saigo Takamori became a national symbol. Poems were written about him. Stories transformed him into a tragic hero. Even the emperor eventually pardoned him posthumously. Why would a government honor a man who had risen against it? Because Japan understood something deeper about Saigo's rebellion. It was not born of ambition. It was born of despair. He did not fight to destroy the new Japan, but because he believed the new Japan had lost its moral compass. In a time of ruthless modernization, he represented the last stand of an older code of honor. Saigo Takamori's life reveals the human cost of progress. Modernization saved Japan from colonization and turned it into a world power, but it also destroyed entire ways of life in the process. The samurai were not simply warriors, they were teachers, administrators, moral leaders. when their world collapsed, many were left without identity, purpose, or dignity. Saigo carried that pain on his shoulders. He helped build a new empire, then died fighting it, because the empire no longer had room for the values he believed defined Japan. In the end, history could not decide whether he was a traitor or a hero, so it made him both. He became the last samurai, not because he was the final man to carry a sword, but because he was the last to live and die entirely by the old code in a world that had already moved on. Today, statues of Saigo Takamori stand in Japan, not as monuments to rebellion, but as reminders of a painful truth. Every great transformation creates winners and victims. Every new era is built on the ruins of the old. And sometimes, the men who help change the world are the ones who suffer most when that change finally arrives. His story is not only the story of Japan's modernization, it is the story of what happens when loyalty collides with progress, when honor confronts necessity, and when a man becomes a legend because he could not survive the future he helped create. Saigo Takamori did not die only on the battlefield. In many ways, he had been dying slowly since the moment he realized that the Japan he helped create no longer needed men like him. After Shiroyama, the government closed the chapter of the samurai with rifles and decrees, but the emotional wound remained open for decades. Thousands of former warriors returned to villages where their swords were now useless and their honor seemed outdated. Some became teachers, some farmers, some policemen. Others drank themselves into oblivion, haunted by the feeling that their entire existence had become irrelevant overnight. This silent tragedy is often ignored when people speak of Japan's miraculous modernization. Railroads, factories, schools, and armies are easier to celebrate than broken identities. Yet Saigo's rebellion was not merely a military event. It was the scream of a class that had lost its meaning. And in that scream, many ordinary Japanese heard something they secretly feared themselves, that the future demanded the sacrifice of everything familiar. After the rebellion, the Meiji government worked hard to control the narrative. Official history books describe Saigo as misguided but sincere, dangerous but honorable. This carefully balanced image allowed the state to both condemn his actions and absorb his legend. Over time, he was transformed from rebel into symbol, from threat into heritage. The same government that crushed his army eventually raised statues in his honor. This transformation reveals how deeply his story resonated with the Japanese soul. Saigo was not remembered as a man who lost, but as a man who refused to compromise his values, even when compromise was the only path to survival. In a nation racing toward the future, he became the embodiment of everything left behind. Decades later, when Japan itself became an imperial power, expanding across Asia, some historians would look back at Saigo with a different lens. They would ask whether his rebellion was not only about samurai pride, but about the moral direction of the new empire. The Meiji state embraced efficiency, power, and discipline, but often at the expense of compassion. Saigo's insistence on honor over success began to look less like stubborn nostalgia and more like a warning that had gone unheeded. Even in popular culture, his figure refused to fade. Plays, novels, and later films reimagined his life in countless ways. Sometimes he was portrayed as the last guardian of ancient virtue, other times as a tragic fool who could not accept reality. But no version could erase the central truth. Saigo Takamori represented a moment when Japan stood at a crossroads, and he chose the path that led to personal destruction. To understand the depth of his tragedy, one must understand how deeply he believed in the emperor. Unlike many political leaders of his time, Saigo did not seek power for himself. He did not dream of ruling Japan, he dreamed of serving it. To him, loyalty was not strategic, it was spiritual. When he rebelled, he believed he was defending the true spirit of the imperial cause against a government that had betrayed its own ideals. That is what makes his story so powerful and so painful. He did not rise against tyranny. He rose against a system he had helped build, because he believed it had lost its soul. Few men in history faced such a cruel paradox. The Satsuma Rebellion became the final proof that the age of swords was over. Yet it also proved something else, that even in a world dominated by rifles and factories, people still long for meaning, for honor, for stories that made sense of sacrifice. Saigo's death did not stop Japan's modernization, but it gave that modernization a human face, a reminder of what had been lost along the way. In the years that followed, Japan would transform into a global power. It would defeat China, then Russia, shocking the world. It would build an empire of its own, becoming the very kind of force that once threatened it. But beneath this rise, the memory of Saigo Takamori lingered like a ghost of conscience. Every time Japan faced a moral crossroads, his story returned, whispered in classrooms, recited in poems, remembered in quiet admiration. Even today, more than a century later, Japanese children learn his name not as a villain, but as a man who chose principle over comfort. In a society that values harmony and obedience, Saigo stands out as the rare figure who followed loyalty to its most dangerous conclusion. His life forces a question that transcends Japan and speaks to every era of transformation. What happens to those who build a new world, only to discover that they no longer belong in it? What happens when progress demands not only adaptation, but the abandonment of identity itself? Saigo Takamori answered that question with his life. He could have lived in peace. He could have accepted a ceremonial role, enjoyed respect, and watched history unfold from a distance. Instead, he chose to walk a path that led directly to destruction. Because to him, a life without honor was already a kind of death. And so, when people speak of the last samurai, they are not merely speaking of the end of a warrior class. They are speaking of the end of a way of understanding the world, where duty outweighed survival and loyalty stood above success. In the mountains of Kagoshima, where his final battle took place, the wind still moves through the trees, just as it did in 1877. Tourists visit the site, taking photographs, reading plaques, then moving on. But for those who truly understand the story, that mountain is not just a historical location. It is the place where Japan said farewell to its past. Saigo Takamori did not live to see the empire Japan would become. Perhaps that is a mercy. Perhaps he could not have endured watching the nation he loved grow powerful by methods he would never have accepted. Or perhaps, had he lived, he would have become the quiet voice, reminding leaders that strength without honor is only another form of defeat. History often remembers conquerors, inventors, and kings. It remembers those who win. But sometimes, the most enduring figures are those who lose everything for what they believe is right. Saigo Takamori lost his position, his reputation, his army, and finally his life. Yet in doing so, he gained something far more powerful. He became a symbol of moral resistance in an age of unstoppable change. And that is why, more than a century later, his story still matters. Not because he was the last samurai to fight, but because he was one of the last men to prove that honor can survive even in defeat. As the years passed after Saigo's death, Japan continued to reshape itself at a speed few societies in history had ever experienced. In barely a generation, the country moved from feudal isolation to industrial power, but every transformation leaves behind shadows, and in Japan, those shadows often took the shape of former samurai walking city streets in Western clothes, trying to remember who they had once been. For many of them, Saigo Takamori became more than a memory. He became a mirror. They saw in him the version of themselves that had refused to surrender quietly. While they adapted, he resisted. While they survived, he chose to die, and that contrast haunted them. Some historians argue that the government's decision to rehabilitate Saigo's image was not an act of mercy, but an act of necessity. A nation that destroys its heroes too completely risks destroying its own legitimacy. By turning Saigo into a tragic patriot rather than a criminal rebel, the Meiji state managed to absorb the pain of the samurai class into a controlled narrative of sacrifice for progress. This pattern would repeat throughout Japanese history. Those who opposed the state were crushed, but later remembered in softened forms, transformed into symbols rather than warnings. In this way, Saigo became not only the last samurai, but also the first of a long line of tragic figures who stood in the way of modernization and paid for it with their lives. Yet behind the symbolism, there remained the human story of a man who had once dreamed of something very simple. Saigo did not envision a Japan of factories and imperial conquest. He envisioned a Japan strong enough to resist humiliation, yet humble enough to preserve its moral core. He wanted a nation that could stand among the powers of the world without losing its soul. The tragedy was that the forces he helped unleash could not be controlled. Once the door to modernization opened, it did not stop at reform. It demanded total transformation. Every tradition became negotiable. Every identity became flexible. And in such a world, men like Saigo became relics overnight. This is why his story feels timeless. Every era produces its own Saigos. People who fight for change only to realize that the change goes further than they ever intended. People who break a system then discover that what replaces it leaves no room for them. In the quiet after his rebellion, Japan entered what many historians call a moral vacuum. The old codes of honor had been dismantled, but new ethical foundations had not yet fully formed. Efficiency replaced virtue, obedience replaced loyalty, success replaced meaning. In this vacuum, Saigo's ghost became stronger than his living presence had ever been. Children learned his name in school not because he won, but because he stood firm. Writers praised him not because he succeeded, but because he refused to bend. And in that refusal, generations found something deeply comforting. In a world that demanded constant adaptation, Saigo represented the idea that some things should never be adapted away. His influence could even be felt decades later in the minds of military officers and politicians who spoke of honor, sacrifice, and destiny. Sometimes they misunderstood him. Sometimes they used his image to justify their own ambitions. But even in those distortions, the power of his legacy remained undeniable. To walk through modern Japan is to walk through the world Saigo could not accept. Skyscrapers stand where samurai estates once stood. Trains run through lands that were once battlefields. Students study English and science in schools built on the ruins of feudal academies. Progress has triumphed in every visible sense. And yet, beneath this modern surface, the story of Saigo Takamori continues to circulate, not as nostalgia, but as a quiet question. What is the price of becoming modern? What must be sacrificed to survive in a changing world, and how many people are left behind in the process? Saigo's life offers no easy answers. He did not stop history. He did not save the samurai. He did not change the course of modernization. But he gave those changes a human cost, a face, a story that cannot be erased by statistics or timelines. When people speak of betrayal, they often mean disloyalty to power. But Saigo's betrayal was different. He betrayed an empire in order to remain loyal to an ideal. He chose to stand against a government he had helped create, not because he hated it, but because he believed it had forgotten why it existed. In that sense, he was not a traitor to Japan. He was a traitor to inevitability. History tends to celebrate those who move with the tide. Saigo stood against it, knowing he would be crushed. That is why his story feels less like a chapter in a textbook and more like a tragedy from ancient literature, where the hero is doomed not by his enemies, but by his own values in a world that no longer shares them. And perhaps that is the deepest reason his legend endures, because it reminds us that progress is never neutral. It always chooses winners and losers. It always demands sacrifices. And sometimes, those sacrifices are not only economic or political, but deeply personal. Saigo Takamori sacrificed everything, his career, his reputation, his life. But in doing so, he preserved something that could not survive in any other way. The memory of a world where honor mattered more than survival. Long after the rifles fell silent at Shiroyama, long after the banners of rebellion were torn down, His story continued to march forward, not in armies, but in hearts, in classrooms, in books, in quiet conversations about what it means to live with integrity when the world rewards compromise. And so, when we speak of the last samurai, we are not only speaking of a man with a sword standing against rifles. We are speaking of a man standing against time itself, a man who looked at the future and said, "This future may be inevitable, but it will not have me." That is the true betrayal that made him immortal. Time has a strange way of softening battles, but sharpening questions. Long after the smoke of the Satsuma rebellion faded, Japan entered the 20th century carrying the unresolved tension between tradition and transformation. Saigo Takamori became the silent witness to that tension, a name invoked whenever the nation faced the uncomfortable truth that progress always leaves scars. In the years after his death, many of his former followers tried to rebuild their lives in the new Japan. Some joined the police force, transforming their warrior discipline into a new kind of service. Others became teachers, passing on fragments of the old moral code to children who would never carry swords. A few entered business, adapting their loyalty to corporations rather than clans. Yet no matter how they adapted, the memory of Saigo lingered like an unspoken standard they felt they could never fully meet. What made Saigo different from so many other defeated leaders in history was that he never tried to escape his fate. He did not flee abroad. He did not attempt to negotiate his way into safety. When the rebellion collapsed, he accepted its consequences with the same calm resolve that had guided his life. To him, honor was not something that could be postponed. It had to be lived completely, even if that meant dying for it. This absolute commitment is what turned him into a moral symbol rather than just a historical figure. Many leaders talk about values. Saigo lived them to the point of self-destruction, and in doing so, he created a legend far more powerful than any political victory could have given him. As Japan moved forward, historians began to debate whether the Satsuma rebellion had any real chance of success. Militarily, the answer is no. Saigo never possessed the numbers, the weapons, or the logistics to defeat the modern imperial army. But to measure his rebellion only in terms of victory or defeat is to misunderstand its true nature. It was never meant to win. It was meant to be heard. In that sense, the rebellion was less a war than a message written in blood. A message that said modernization, without moral reflection, leads to spiritual emptiness. A message that warned that efficiency can become cruelty when it forgets compassion. A message that progress without purpose can destroy the very people who make it possible. These ideas would echo decades later when Japan faced the devastation of another transformation after the Second World War. Once again, the nation would be forced to reinvent itself. Once again, traditions would be questioned, identities reshaped, and values reconsidered, and once again, the story of Saigo Takamori would resurface as a reminder that dignity matters even when survival is at stake. In post-war Japan, his image took on new meaning. No longer just the last samurai, he became a symbol of integrity in defeat. In a country struggling with guilt, loss, and rebuilding, his story offered a strange kind of comfort. It showed that even in failure, one could preserve honor, that even when history turns against you, you can still choose who you are. This is why Saigo's legacy transcends Japan. His life speaks to any society facing rapid change, to workers displaced by machines, to communities erased by development, to cultures overshadowed by globalization. His story asks a simple but painful question. What do we owe to the people whose world must die so that a new one can be born? Saigo Takamori never found an answer that allowed him to live in peace. Instead, he chose to become the embodiment of that question. He turned his life into a final argument that some values deserve to be defended even when they are no longer practical. When historians look back at the Meiji Restoration, they often celebrate it as one of the most successful modernizations in history. Japan avoided colonization. It built a strong state. It entered the global stage as an equal. But beneath this success lies a quieter narrative of loss. The loss of local identities, the loss of ancient customs, the loss of people who could not adapt quickly enough. Saigo stands at the center of that quieter narrative, not because he was the only one who suffered, but because he chose to make suffering visible. He refused to disappear quietly. He refused to let the end of the samurai pass without witness. His rebellion forced the nation to confront the human cost of its own survival. In doing so, he became something rare in history, a man who lost everything and yet shaped how victory would be remembered. Even now, when visitors stand before his statue in Ueno Park, they do not see a defeated general. They see a man walking his dog, dressed simply, looking more like a humble citizen than a legendary warrior. That image is no accident. It reflects how Japan ultimately chose to remember him, not as a conqueror, not as a rebel, but as a man of character. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The man who took up arms against the modern state is now embraced by that same state as a moral example. The man who could not survive in the new Japan has become one of its most enduring symbols. History often resolves its deepest conflicts not by choosing sides, but by transforming enemies into lessons. Saigo Takamori was once seen as a threat to stability. Today, he is seen as a reminder of conscience. His life teaches that sometimes the most important battles are not those that decide who rules, but those that decide what kind of people we become while ruling. And so his story continues, not as a tale of swords and gunfire, but as a meditation on loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of progress.